as part of that class, we had to build an offer and sell that offer to, and define who we wanted to sell it to, and then sell it to at least one customer. And so the offer that I put together was a coaching package. It was a package of 3 sessions to help somebody kind of like reinvent their life. And also, right, is like this analogy of there is strength in being like a tree, right? A tree with very deep roots, and you're like a redwood or a sequoia, and you are strong because you are like solidified in one place.
Being fractional, you see a lot of things, you work with a lot of different people, a lot of different projects, companies. What would you describe as your most fracked up moment?
Life is about trade-offs, and the things that you want change over time.
Welcome to OFRAC, the podcast where top fractional leaders share their wins, struggles, and stories from the trenches. Hosted by Adir Ron.
Welcome to OFRAC, the podcast where we dive into the world of fractional leadership. I'm your host, Adir Ron, Fractional CMO, and today I'm hosting Sean MacMannis. Hi,
Hello.
Sean.
How's it going? It's great to be here.
It's great to have you here. Thank you for joining. So maybe I'll introduce you real quick, and then you'll probably do a better job anyway. So Sean is 15 years in tech and marketing. He helped scale Pinterest's ad business to 1 billion. He was at a pivotal marketing role at Clubhouse and at a bunch of other places as well. And then after hitting that peak of chasing success on someone else's terms, Sean made a leap into fractional work, launched Positive Sum Marketing, and started coaching. And today, Sean advocates for freedom, flexibility, and building a career that actually works for you. So, Sean, thank you for joining. And maybe I'll start off with an icebreaker question. You describe yourself as a trail runner and a dad of 3. So, what's harder, launching a DAO product or getting 3 kids out the door in the morning?
I would say launching a DAO product is harder. At this point, I have quite a bit of practice on the dad front. I have an 11-year-old, an 8.5-year-old, and a 11-month-old. Yeah, the older ones are like pretty good, pretty easy at this point most of the time. So yeah. Okay.
Well, if you'd ask me, I would probably say the other way around, but my kids are a bit of a different age. I have a 6 and 4, so getting them out the door in the morning sometimes feels harder than convincing a VC to invest in my startup.
It gets easier. Yeah.
Okay, so I have hope. Okay, and we'll get back to trail running later, because I think that's an interesting topic to cover, and kind of how that connects with fractional work and fractional mindset. And I'd love to hear your take on that. But maybe we'll start at the top. How the frac did you get here? So we're gonna be playing on the frac word constantly. Yeah. That's just my silly humor. Maybe you want to share a bit about your background, your journey, what led you all the way to where you are today.
Definitely, yeah. So I worked in online advertising from 2007 to 2019 with a short stint. After taking a little career break in 2015, I traveled around the country in a 1973 Airstream with my 1-year-old.
Wow.
And did a little bit of consulting after that trip before starting at Pinterest in 2016. And, then in 2021, I went into blockchain and Web3 first full-time, actually. And then the organization that I was working for, Gitcoin, I was running marketing for them, reporting to the COO, and they ended up actually progressively decentralizing, as we called it, turning into a DAO. And so we all resigned our full-time roles. And then many of us continued on working for the DAO as independent contractors. So we had to get a business up and running in order to make that change of our own, an LLC, right, to facilitate that.
Yeah.
And so about 5 or 6 months after that transition of going from full-time for a startup, traditional startup, to full-time still, but as a contractor, I ended up parting ways with Gitcoin and then transitioning to being a fractional head of marketing for another project, which was
also in the Web3 space.
Also in Web3, yeah, it was called Radical at the time, and I rebranded it with the co-founders to RadWorks as the DAO entity. And Yeah, so that was my change. My change was basically within the same organization, making a change to contractor. And then once I left that organization, going from full-time contractor, I had this realization when I was leaving of like, okay, so did I just like lose my only client or did I just get laid off? Because the way I'd gotten the job was as an employee, but then it had kind of shifted. And so the reality of it, like legally, was that I had lost my only client, right? And that I hadn't diversified. Not that I'd been laid off, but I did actually, try to use the layoff as a way to get severance, which I did get at the time, as if, kind of I'd been laid off. So it was a little bit of a hybrid, right? Where that organization that I had left was transitioning and the way that they were treating employees was they were trying to treat them as well as they could, right? When changes needed to be made.
Okay, and that's so in a way it's kind of like I would say almost a soft entrance into the fractional world. On one hand, but then on the other, like you said, you've had one client, you essentially found yourself almost unwillingly and without planning as a fractional marketeer, and then with just one client, and then it's that question of like what happens when that client suddenly leaves or lets you go. How was that experience? So like how soon did you land?
It did, to be honest, it didn't take long to find another client. And then I found Clubhouse as well, right around the same time, started working with them. So then I had 2 clients, and then I found a third, Commonwealth. And then I kind of was like, okay, yeah, wow, this is actually a lot of work. 3 clients is a lot. And the one client was like 50% of my time, the RadWorks was. And so I would say it was not the most difficult transition that point, but it wasn't easy. I definitely had to really process the change and really quickly lean into this idea of working for multiple organizations, working with multiple organizations instead of like applying. And it actually seemed like the most logical step though at the time, whereas in previous transitions that hadn't been the case.
What do you mean?
In previous transition, I guess before, for whatever reason, when I was working more in online advertising, I didn't really think about the option of being a fractional marketing leader. So it was only once I moved into Web3, once I had my own business set up, that I saw that as like a path that I could go down.
Got it. It's also kind of like you're, in a way, once you're already thinking about it, once you already have like the technical setup in terms of the ability to work legally, and it's already out there. That's, I guess, in a way, when you start thinking about it more, and suddenly it makes more sense.
Yeah.
Cool.
I do think that blockchain was maybe a little bit earlier to this than, and more open to fractional than some other industries. I think it does really vary by industry, whether it's something that they are familiar with, whether the founders think it's a good idea, whether they know how to find people, that type of thing.
Yeah, I agree. Did a Web3 customer ever offer to pay you in cryptocurrency instead of? Did you ever take it?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, it was a liquid cryptocurrency. So I guess, right. And so if it's liquid and they're basing the dollar, they're basing what they're paying you on dollars, then at the time of the transfer to your wallet, then you can just sell it on an exchange, and it kind of doesn't really matter whether it's, dollars or the native token.
Got it. Okay, that's interesting.
As long as you know how to do that, which I didn't originally, but then figured it out, right?
If you work in the industry.
Well, and there's nothing like, needing to figure it out to get paid as an incentive to figure it out.
To figuring stuff out. Yeah, that's true. And how I'm interested to hear if you're willing to elaborate a bit about Clubhouse. I remember the Clubhouse craze. I remember being out of the Clubhouse craze because when it just started, I was an Android user, and I was really bummed out of not being into the party. And then at some point it got released on Android, and I was like, okay, it's cool, but maybe I'm late to the party. Maybe all Android users are a bit late to the party. So kind of wondering what's your take on Clubhouse? How was that for you?
So I was not there during the heyday, and to be honest, they didn't have very many employees back then. It kind of like that was during COVID, and I think it was early 2021 and the end of 2020 that they that kind of like most people think of as, you know, the time that Elon Musk went on and all that. And I was on Clubhouse at the time, but I wasn't working there. And so what I came on to help Clubhouse with was their monetization, which they wanted at the time, the part that I worked on, at least, they wanted to use like a Web3 monetization. They wanted to essentially create the different clubs, or what they changed them to be houses. They made houses invite only, and clubs like were the bigger ones, not invite only. So they wanted the houses to be DAOs, and they were basically like built out some of the initial infrastructure to allow those DAOs to like have their own token and the way that all DAOs do. And so that's what I was working on. But I would say that it was in the backdrop of the user base, you know, being not growing, unfortunately.
Got it. So, you know, kind of going back to your first steps as a fractional leader, and we talked about how you found yourself fractional, and then you found yourself without that first customer anymore, and kind of needing to, you know, kind of go out and figuring out, okay, where do I get my next business? We started talking before we hit record about building diversified income streams and how critical it is as a fractional leader. So kind of wondering what's your perspective? How would you advise someone starting today? And we'll get more into tips later, but specifically on diversifying income streams and how you see that.
I think the first step is kind of like psychological, actually. The first step, at least for me, is basically thinking of a full-time job as like only one available option, and where a full-time job is like a bundle of things. You're selling all of your time and expertise to one company for an indefinite period of time, right? And you actually have, in many cases, terms in the contract that you sign that say that you can't do other types of work at the same time, right? And that doesn't exclude all types of work, right? It doesn't typically exclude like having a rental property and selling, you know, and like renting it out on Airbnb, for example. So I actually experimented with other revenue streams alongside full-time job before I made the transition to work as a fractional. And one of those was actually that Airstream that I mentioned earlier. After we returned back from the trip, I rented it out on this site called Outdoorsy for people to use, and actually with my tow vehicle as well, for people to use that if they didn't have one. And so that became kind of like a side income stream while I was doing consulting during that period of time before I worked at Pinterest. And so I got used to this idea of having multiple revenue streams kind of through that. And then I would say once I started working at Gitcoin, around the same time, I started coaching. And I was part of this course called Minimalist Entrepreneur, which was put on by Sahil Lavingia, who was one of the early engineers at Pinterest and started Gumroad. And he did this cohort-based course around the creation of a book called Minimalist Entrepreneur. And as part of that class, we had to build an offer and sell that offer and define who we wanted to sell it to, and then sell it to at least one customer. And so the offer that I put together was a coaching package. It was a package of 3 sessions to help somebody kind of like reinvent their life. And I had recently come from sort of a reinvention of my own. And so I was like really inspired to help somebody else to do that same thing. And so that kind of became my side hustle, if you will, or like additional revenue stream while I was at Gitcoin. And then more recently, I've leaned into that a bit more too.
So that was kind of like your foray into coaching.
Yeah, selling that first package was my first coaching client. And actually that person who bought that course, that set of 3, I'm still working with him. So I've now seen him for 85 sessions.
Wow. That is a lot of time.
Yeah. So like 3 years, I think, every other week for like 3 years. Yeah.
That's amazing. And so where do you see yourself more today? More on doing consulting and fractional marketing jobs, more on the coaching, a bit of both? Like, where do you like to find your balance?
So I definitely like make a higher share of my revenue on the marketing consulting side. And I would say I spend more time there as well. But I would say that at least for the past few months, I've spent more time and more energy writing about the coaching concepts. And that's what more of my LinkedIn is, I guess, which is my primary channel. And my newsletter. It's a little bit of a hybrid. So I like to say that they actually kind of like supplement each other. My background in marketing is product marketing. And I think that the best marketing, and product marketing is very personal and comes across in a personal way and comes from a person as opposed to from a company. And so I try to help companies to kind of like use that personal voice, develop that personal voice and that personal story, and work with founders to do that. And then on the other side, I help individual people kind of like productize their skills so that they sound bigger and they sound more like a company, right? And so I see them as kind of like the opposite sides of the same coin in a way, of like productizing a person versus kind of like personalizing a product. And so it's fun to do both.
It's kind of like product marketing for a company versus product marketing for an individual in a way, like
So
highlighting your strengths.
On the individual side, I don't talk about product marketing because they don't think of themselves as a product, right? And they don't use those types of terms, but the core area of it kind of is. It's like, what is your niche, and what is your key message, and things like that are like definitely product marketing concepts.
Exactly, like highlighting your strengths and figuring out how to shine on those areas. And I totally get it. It's a nice duality. So kind of continuing on along that thread, you're also a trail runner, right? And that also ties into your newsletter, which is Trail and Error, which is another play on words, obviously already sold. So when did you start running trails?
Yeah, I started trail running in 2020 as well. And I started with a Ragnar team relay race up in the Pacific Northwest with some friends. And then a couple years ago, I started doing half marathons every quarter. So now that's what I've continued to do, is the Ragnar each year, which is a 250-mile race with 12 people, where one team member is always running. And that goes for like 26 consecutive hours overnight and stuff. And then the every local races every few months or so here in town, and then just regular training runs around the hilly parts of San Francisco.
And where do you see those converge? Marketing for startups and Web3 and product marketing, and coaching on the other hand, and trail running, kind of continuing on that thread. Where do they converge?
So, I mean, they converge in my story and in my writing. I took this course with Amanda Getz, and she talks about your spice or your secret sauce, like that type of concept of how do you bring in like part of yourself that is interesting into your kind of like your personal brand. And so I would say that that's a more recent evolution of using the running and running metaphors and my passion for running, and having that be integrated with the stories that I'm telling in order to make it more personal to me and more interesting and more unique. But in terms, so that's sort of like the outward facing, how they intersect is kind of like that they're a part of this narrative that, and like, kind of content strategy that I've created for myself. But then from a personal standpoint, trail running is a time or a place or an activity that allows me to just feel really good in a different way than work does. And also I spend a lot of time parenting in confined spaces, and my kids like staying home and, all that type of stuff.
Yeah.
And so being out in nature, and there's so much of that here where I live, that's just, epic mountain trails and coastline. And it's just a great compliment to my life. The endorphins, the running endorphins you get are no joke as well. And I definitely went through a period of time in my life and work where I didn't do any real physical activity. And now I really try to prioritize it and prioritize myself and taking time for myself.
Which is so important and also works really well with a fractional mindset. Can share from my side as well that once I went fractional, taking care of myself became much easier, and started climbing up in kind of like that ladder of priorities. I could no longer justify not doing it because I'm working full-time job and parenting and doing everything in between, and like, there's just no time to to go outside and start running, or to hit the gym, or to do Pilates or yoga, or all the things that I wanted to do. And like suddenly I couldn't run away from it anymore. So I just had to start doing it. And the change was fantastic.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, it's logical in a way. I had the same, right? The same mentality kind of is like, oh, I don't have the time to do it. Maybe because like I said, right, like sold the entire bundle of like essentially all of my time to someone else.
Exactly.
Right. But at the same time, that is not, it's a cage that I put myself in. I now recognize, right?
Exactly.
Because there are other people, my wife included, who like prioritizes working out. She has a full-time job. It's not like her company doesn't allow her to do that. Like, you know what I mean? Like we have a baby. She helps take care of my older kids too, right? Like this is a cage that I put myself in. It was not required for me to literally not work out because I was working a full-time job. That's ridiculous, right?
Of course, yeah. But I totally get it. That mental cage that we put ourselves into, and I totally relate to that. So kind of switching the topic a bit, and I noticed that you're a part of a lot of communities as well. District and Fractionals United and Next Play. Where do you see communities kind of fit into your day, into your work as a fractional? Is it more on the business lever of generating more kind of demand, or is it something that's more on the coaching side, or like something a bit more for the soul, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, I would say it serves multiple purposes, but I've never gotten a marketing client from any of these communities that I've been a part of. Actually, that's not true. As I said it, I thought of one. I have gotten one. I've also gotten like one coaching client, but I would say that is not the primary objective. The primary objective is I put this in the bundle that you get when you join a company. When you join a company, one of the things that are in that bundle, right? One is health insurance. That's important here in the US, right?
Yeah.
Another is, you're bundling all of your time, selling it to one entity, right? But another is that you're kind of like, you're getting community. You're getting a group. And this is especially true if it's not remote, right? If it's more in person,
Yeah.
You're getting a group of people almost like, friends, or right, your colleagues that you spend time with and you go get a drink with after work, that type of thing. And I think when you don't have that, when you don't have a full-time job, you don't have that built-in community, you miss it. You feel like, oh, there is something missing if you aren't a part of one or more communities. And so what I like about this cross-section of communities that I've become a part of, Fractionals United is pretty much all virtual. District is mostly based here in San Francisco, so I actually mostly do in-person events for that one. And then Next Play, I've done both in person as well as virtual. And so I think definitely getting in some physical in-person time, if you work remotely, is crucial. And I've sought that out.
Amazing. It's also great that you can balance the physical and the virtual as well. And I never thought about it as kind of like that bundle of, kind of like a full-time job replacement in a way. So that's a very, very interesting perspective. Okay, let's change the subject a bit again. Being being fractional, you see a lot of things, you work with a lot of different people, a lot of different projects, companies. What would you describe as your most fracked up moment?
Well, let's see. I mean, honestly, in my life, the thing that made me go fractional really kind of indirectly was getting divorced. So I would say I basically started going through a divorce at the beginning of 2020. I had 2 kids at the time. Now I have 3, one with my now wife. And that really provided me with in some ways, actually, you could argue that maybe it was caused by me choosing myself and choosing a path of more freedom and less stability or predictability, maybe to a certain degree, and less financial certainty. And because I had quit my job, and that was like one of the ending at Pinterest, that was one of the like kind of like final pieces of that, previous marriage. So, not that I don't advocate for divorces, but I would say that in my case, it was an important part of my journey. I don't regret it, nor do I regret getting married, right? In the past, definitely not. But yeah, that's what comes to mind is like a major turning point that like, not immediately, but eventually resulted in me going fractional.
Interesting. I can totally relate. By the way, if I think back on my career, it's been not with a divorce, but very, very similar, like a pivotal moment in life that kind of influences all other decisions. So, in my case, it was moving from Israel to the Netherlands. And when I moved here, from Israel to the Netherlands, I was still full-time CMO. And I was holding on to that position as like the one rock of stability where all of our life is changing and moving with 2 kids and a new language and new everything. And I at least have my job as like my stable rock of sanity. And then we landed, and 2 months later, I was like, why am I holding on to this rock? Like, this wind of change is sweeping across my entire life. And I'm holding on to this one thing because I think it would give me stability, but it's not. It's actually causing frustration and like doing the exact opposite of what it should. And I let go. And there was, a big decision to let go amidst everything else that's happening. And then suddenly it became, the right thing to do. And things started falling into place.
There's this really interesting metaphor that I kind of like came up with as I was doing some thinking around the differences between having a full-time job and fractional work and also, right, is like this analogy of there is strength in being like a tree, right? A tree with very deep roots, and you're like a redwood or a sequoia, and you are strong because you are like solidified in one place. And so if you bring that analogy to like, to people, if you're building community and friends and right in like one place physically, then that can be a source of strength. But then there's also the adaptation of a tumbleweed, and how a tumbleweed can kind of go anywhere. And it's like, right, it has everything that it needs just within that one thing, and it can move, right?
Exactly.
And if a flood comes to its one area, it can go to a completely different area. Or like, right, me moving into an airstream, like, right, and being able to find home like anywhere physically, as long as I was like with my family. And so it's like, right, like playing around with that is, I think, a part of maturing in life, is being like, okay, I can find strength in other places, right, besides in a job. And maybe that like things turn from a strength to like a hindrance, to an anchor, right? An anchor in a bad way, not an anchor in a good way.
Yeah. Exactly.
Like a ball and chain. There you go. That's a negative anchor, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that I agree. I think it's a part of maturity phase, and not necessarily that if you're working full-time job, then you're not mature. And, it's different people have different needs and different things that fit them. But it definitely resonates with me that it's a mental process.
Yeah.
So thanks for
and
sharing
it's
that.
about, right, it's about, if the previous thing isn't working for you in some reason or another, then there's a change that, right, it's not about like just blowing up your life for no reason, but it's like, if something's not working, then finding strength and finding other opportunities to reframe your previous kind of like stories that you were telling yourself about what success was or whatever.
Yeah. Well put. Okay, so let's change the pace a bit and let's kind of switch into a quick-fire round. So maybe I'll ask you a few quick questions and kind of see the first thing that comes to mind. So fact or fiction, or should I say frac or fiction? People typically think that fractional means just part-time. And what's your take on that?
I think a lot of people are confused. I think that sometimes for some people they think, oh yeah, that's just part-time. But I mean, I think part-time is a component. So I don't think they're wrong if they think that that's part of it.
Okay. What's your number one tool in your toolkit of being a fractional leader?
Versatility.
Interesting.
That's where if you mean, so that's, I guess, a mental tool, a psychological tool. A more literal tool might be, I mean, notes. The notes app is where I spend probably most of my time. And that's where I just jot down thoughts and things like that. So I think that is the foundation of actually across personal as well as business.
How do you manage your notes and still stay on top of them? If that's out of the quick fire, that's just a personal interest.
So I mostly use them, I think, for creation as opposed to going back. But each week, one of them is that like each week I create like the main goals for that week. And so then that one I go back to multiple times throughout the week, but I use it.
So kind of journaling mindset.
Yeah. All of my posts start as notes as well. Yeah. It's a lot of different things. It's task tracking, it's journaling, it's note taking, like for meetings and action items and things like that. So tasks kind of get started there, created there, right? I find Notion too complicated for these types of uses, for me at least. Yeah.
Same here.
Yeah.
I'm trying to make it work, but I think I'm about to give up for the fourth time.
Okay.
Maybe the last. I'm like, okay,
Right?
it just doesn't work for me.
Right. Notes app is like very close to literally a piece of paper, right? In terms of functionality. And, yeah. Notion is just, it can do so much. It's like, is that good? Is that bad? Depends on what you're trying to do.
Yeah. I had a great conversation with a friend who works at a VC, and he's like, he swears by his Notion. And I'm like, it's too wide for me. It's like too open-ended. I need some constraints, some borders, so I can thrive between them, at least on that part. Okay, dream client and nightmare client. It doesn't have to be, let's not name drop.
Right. Some attributes of, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Some attributes of a dream client is that they know what they think good is when it comes to marketing, but they don't have a like prescribed way that they need to get there, right? So they have a sense of taste or a sense of, I like that, I don't like that. That's necessary, actually. I've worked with some clients that don't really have that, and it's very difficult for me. But then if they're too experienced in marketing, then they really, then that can be hard too. So that's why I say is number one. I love also early stage products and organizations. And I also love, not super like heavy, growth expectations at that time period. I like to be a part of the earlier time period where it's more about ideation, creating value, and less about like capturing value. Yeah. So there's a few things. And then nightmare client. Yeah. A nightmare client is someone who basically knows exactly what they think marketing should look like, how that person should spend their day, should spend their week, what channels everyone should be on every day, how much time it should take, right? Like, and then expects everyone to live up to that exact version every day, every week, micromanages them through that. That's horrible, right? I can see you nodding like you've had that experience.
Unfortunately, yes. It's like, why don't you just do the job yourself?
Yeah, there is a middle ground, right? Where like you don't want somebody who has zero marketing knowledge, zero marketing expertise, zero marketing, like, right? Like the classic like engineer founder that doesn't know anything about marketing, because in many cases they don't realize how difficult it is, how iterative it is, how experimental it is, how long things can take, right? But then at the same time, you don't want somebody who's like so deep in marketing that they like know exactly how to do it. They think they're better than you. They think they're better than everyone that works for them at marketing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I worked with one of those. Yeah. Unfortunately.
And it's like, is the porridge too hot? Is the porridge too cold?
Exactly. Okay. Where do you see the future of fractional work?
I think it will become more mainstream. So similar to remote work, I think that there was a moment where remote kind of went from just being a thing that a couple random companies did to being like a real alternative. Well, for a while it was like dominant, but it wasn't really, that was sort of like a freak moment that happened that was temporary, right? And it became like the only way that people could get work done for a period of time. I don't think that that's the future, right? For Fractional. I don't think Fractional is going to take over. There won't be any full time, that type of thing. But I think it's going to go from like this random side thing that, you know, most people don't really talk about or know about, and most founders have never hired one or anything like that, to something that's like, okay, yeah, I know that this is the time and the place where Fractional is the right thing. And like that list of ways that make it the right thing becomes more standardized, right, in the knowledge of founders across the board. And I could list out what some of those attributes are, but that wouldn't be rapid fire.
Yeah. Okay, so let's wrap this up with one last question, which is not rapid fire, so feel free to elaborate. If you could give one piece of advice to someone who's thinking about going fractional today, what would that be?
It's introspection, to be honest. I know this sounds probably pretty crazy, but like it is very important that before you get into something like this, that you are really honest with yourself, that you're choosing it for the right reasons. In life, I think you choose your hard, right? You choose what your struggles are going to be. You may have illusions that you're going to find this nirvana or, place that is perfect in every single way. It doesn't exist, right? Life is about trade-offs, and the things that you want change over time. And so it could very much be the case that Fractional is great for you for a period of time. And, I have conversations literally every week where I talk to people who are navigating and who are thinking about going fractional. And in many cases, I try to talk them out of it. Not because I don't want more competition or anything like that. I don't care, right? I think rising tide lifts all boats in this area, but more because it doesn't actually solve for what they're trying to solve for. It's just a thing that they see as being interesting. So one example was a woman I talked to like the week before last. She both was thinking about changing industries as well as thinking about changing to fractional. And I ended up, kind of like, and seemed like she was indifferent. She said that she was indifferent to those two paths. But my advice was actually to stay full-time and to change industries. That seemed like the thing that she was more passionate, the change that she was more passionate about making. And I think it's easier to make one change at a time. I don't necessarily recommend moving to, another country and quitting your job at the same time. I mean, you didn't do it, but you did it later.
Yeah.
Right? And actually, I think that 2 months made a big difference. You might have felt very different if you literally moved there, you didn't have a job. How hard would it have been to find a place to live, for example, without a job? Pretty hard.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, even if it's in rapid succession, oftentimes, and it's executed against a plan, executing decisions one by one, instead of doing them all at the same time, tends to be a better fit for people. Yeah. Introspection. Okay. That was the answer. Going back to it is like, it's really just being honest with yourself about what you actually care about.
That's a great piece of advice. And I wouldn't expect any other piece of advice from a coach. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. So I think that wraps up this episode of OFRAC with Sean MacMannis. So thank you again very, very much for joining today. Where can we find you if someone wants to, sign up to trial and error? Where do they find you? Or if they want to talk to you about marketing jobs or about coaching?
Thank you so much, Adir, for hosting. I had a fracking good time, and I was waiting to use that one. So yeah, if you want to follow along, I mostly post and these days on LinkedIn for things about future of work, my ideas on coaching and fractional work, and all sorts of things like that. I have a newsletter as well, which is Trail and Error. It's hosted on Beehive, so it's trailanderror.beehive.com. And yeah, thanks again for having me. This is great.
Thank you very much. And that's it for us for today. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe, leave a review, like, share, follow, all the different things that people say at the end of episodes. And we'll see you next time.